moving to agenda item 14, we have a presentation on the Federation of State Medical Boards policy on physician sexual misconduct. Dr. King is a past chair of the FSMB Board of Directors. She currently serves on the FSMB Foundation Board, the FSMB Pandemic Preparedness Work Group, and the FSMB Education Committee. Dr. King is currently a professor of medicine at the University of Vermont Larner's College of Medicine, where she is an active in medical school curriculum development and medical student teaching. In his role at the FSMB, Mr. Stats is responsible for developing organizational policy related to medical regulation, advising on educational initiatives, and supporting the FSMB's work in ethics and professionalism and the work group on physician sexual misconduct. Mr. Stats is currently writing a doctoral dissertation on conflicting rights and health policy. Dr. King and Mr. Stats, thank you for joining us. You may begin.
Good afternoon. I think I'm calling in from Burlington, Vermont. Can you hear me, Denise?
Yes.
Thank you. So it is afternoon here and morning in California, but I want to thank you so much for the invitation for Mr. Stas and myself to present today for your meeting. As Ms. Pine said, that we will be presenting on the newly adopted FSMB policy on physician sexual misconduct that was adopted at the annual meeting virtually last early May. And I think that Mark will be working the slides. We're going to be going back and forth with both of us presenting different parts. And so we'll be communicating back and forth as we work through these slides. So Mark, if you can advance to the next slide, please. So this, again, this just gives an outline of what our presentation will be today. I'm going to begin with background regarding the FSMB prior policy, as well as how we came to revisit our prior policy and develop the new policy that was just adopted. Mark will spend some time talking about the work group and the procedures and meetings and kind of approach that we took, as well as discussing some of the key issues in our findings and discussions. And then we'll both share in presenting the major recommendations of the work group and then finish up with time for question and answer period. We really hope that we'll have a good exchange of questions and answers today, and we're really looking forward to your comments. California was very helpful in the development of the policy, and especially Carrie Webb, who attended one of our symposium that the work group held. So on the next slide, I just want to begin by giving some background. As we all know, sexual misconduct and physician sexual misconduct is a grave concern for all of the 71 medical boards across the states and territories of the U.S. And it's not a new issue at all. And in fact, in 2006, the Federation at that time had adopted a policy on physician sexual misconduct. But more recently, a lot of new light has been shown on the topic, and I really look to 2016 as a especially important turning point. In July of 2016, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution published a series of stories on physician sexual misconduct. It was really very complete. Their reporting told the stories of patients, told the stories of misconduct by physicians, and was really quite critical of some state boards at certain times in terms of their delay in public protection. FSMB issued a statement following this publication, and again, issued a statement of absolutely no tolerance for sexual misconduct and quoted the 2006 policy. But on the heels of this, really, there were several other very prominent cases that came to everyone's attention across the U.S. I mean, obviously, Larry Nassar and his former employment with U.S. Gymnastics and Michigan State University, George Tyndall at USC, and his work as a gynecologist, which the California board is well aware of, Richard Strauss at Ohio State, and his work with student athletes there as a sports team doctor. These three cases were all involved with students at universities, but in addition, there were many cases in the public sector outside of academics and colleges, including Robert Haddon, a New York City gynecologist, and many others. So with the AJC report, and then many of these very prominent cases coming out really kind of simultaneously and one after another, obviously there were many indications of a system that was broken or not working. Multiple people were involved. There were clearly delays in reporting of cases to law enforcement and to state boards. There was delay in action, and there was really time for more harm to be occurring to the public. So in this environment, as I became chair of the Federation's board in 2018, it was clearly time to reevaluate our 2006 policy. And as a result, we formed a work group and went to work to really try to take a new look, step back and really evaluate the old policy, look at it in the setting of 2018, and then make some changes. So this slide really just reminds us of the 2006 policy. And I looked it over again this morning. When you read it, it's not that the policy isn't a good policy, but it's just lacking in many ways, and especially with a new lens on this in 2018, we saw a lot of shortcoming. And when we started, we thought, well, we'll just have to revise this policy. But in the end, we really made a total change and ended up incorporating many new thoughts and new approaches to what we felt the state boards needed to be doing. So on the next slide, again, when we started, every work group has a charge, and I think this is a good charge, but it had some shortcomings in the end, and I'll be critical of it because I wrote the charge, and it was a good place to start. But really, our work group grew so much in what we learned as we went through this process that we went significantly beyond what the charge was. I mean, we started with collecting available disciplinary data, and there were really some pretty good papers that had recently come out that looked at disciplinary data on physician sexual misconduct. And what we could see, I mean, from the get-go was that this was grossly underreported, that the offenders often and most often repeated misconduct and repeated misconduct in an escalating way. So it was clear to everyone on the work group that early reporting was crucial in order to prevent. And then we also saw the importance for a need for cultural change as we read the literature, and a need to include not just the state boards, but all organizations involved in medicine. We wanted to identify barriers. Clearly, barriers to reporting were a major contributing factor to harm, but it wasn't just the victims themselves, but it was the barriers that everyone and everything presented. So we wanted to be very inclusive of having everyone take ownership on the responsibility for reporting, both to state boards and to law enforcement. We also wanted to evaluate what state boards were already doing to address this important issue. We often find that state boards in their individual states are doing some really important and progressive work. And I will say that California was a very important state in that regard. I've mentioned culture already, and we really wanted to assess the prevalence of sexual misconduct training in medical school and graduate medical education. And we looked to the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report that had just come out when our work group started, that really pointed to problems in medicine, kind of a permissive environment of harassment, and the need for that to change. And then, as I said, we also wanted to look at the existing FSMB policy and provide new guidance. And as I already indicated, in the end, we ended up making quite a bit of change in order to better serve the public as we move forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark. And as I said, we'll be going back and forth, but I'll turn things over to him for him to explain a little bit more about the work group process.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. King, and thanks to the Medical Board of California for having us with you today. As Dr. King mentioned, I'll talk a bit about our process generally at the Federation of State Medical Boards for developing policy. And we typically do this through a committee or a work group approach. Often work groups will involve maybe 5 to 7 or so representatives from state medical boards, as well as any subject matter experts that we need to bring in based on the topic at hand. So this was a particularly big work group. We had representation from 12 medical boards of varying sizes, structures, and geography. And we also brought in 2 different subject matter experts. One was a physician bioethicist from Harvard, and the other was an expert in professional boundaries, specifically related to remediation of boundary violations. We also had representation from Canada. Our sister organization, the Federation of Medical Regulatory Authorities of Canada, had their CEO on our work group as well. So we were able to bring in a pretty broad representation of the voices of the medical regulatory authorities across the US. We also tried to make this a really inclusive process whereby we took advantage of as many opportunities as we could to hear about the experiences of medical boards with respect to both sexual misconduct as well as issues that might relate to the duty to report or to professionalism in general. So we started that off with the 2018 FSMB annual meeting, where we held a sexual boundaries breakout session. So this was mainly an educational session, but also gave us an opportunity to hear about some of the key issues that boards were facing. And we followed this up with 2 annual surveys where we asked a number of questions to state medical boards, but included several about sexual misconduct and boundary violations. And then at our 2019 FSMB annual meeting, many of you on the call have probably been to the FSMB meetings and have been to our breakout sessions or our board forums. These are usually attended by about 30 to 50 people. But when we had a sexual boundaries forum, we had at least 200 people in the room. It was a very large conference room and it was standing room only. And there were a lot of passionate positions presented. And so we knew this was a key issue already, but we heard a lot more nuance during that day that we were able to bring back to our work group and inform the policy that we eventually developed. Dr. King mentioned a symposium that we held in Washington, D.C. that was attended by Carrie Webb from the Medical Board of California. We brought in additional boards. We thought, we've already had good representation on the work group, but we brought in representatives from other boards that we hadn't heard from yet, again, including California. And we examined some of the key issues that had already been identified throughout the process, and I'll talk about some of these in a moment. And then finally, as we always do, once we developed a draft of the policy, we held a consultation. Normally our consultations or our comment periods last for about 30 days. This time we approximately doubled that duration because we knew we would be receiving more comments than usual. And we did, in fact, receive more comments than we're used to seeing. So only receive comment from state medical boards themselves as our members. This time, we really did our best to identify several different external partner organizations, also public organizations, patient advocacy groups, and flagged our policy for them, shared a draft with them, and asked for their feedback. Another way that we find is really helpful for bringing in external feedback, and we started doing this when we examined the issue of physician wellness and burnout in 2016, is we held a 2-day meeting, again in Washington, D.C., where we invited several different external stakeholders to come to us and do 2 things. One, talk about the issue of sexual misconduct from their perspective, what they were doing in their organizations, or why it was important to them, and then to tell us what they think we ought to be doing. So this meeting had representation from a fairly broad array of stakeholders, from the American Medical Association, the American Osteopathic Association. We had patient advocacy groups present. We had the Council of Medical Specialty Societies. We had student organizations present. And probably most importantly at this meeting, we had 2 survivors of sexual misconduct at the come and speak to us. They spent the longest duration to us. This portion of our meeting was closed. And over the course of a half a day, they recounted their experiences and told us what they thought needed to be done to effect change throughout the medical system, but specifically in medical regulation with state medical boards. So this meeting was particularly important for developing the eventual recommendations that came out of the policy. So some of the things that we learned needed to be key areas of focus in revising this policy. It involved barriers to reporting. We knew that the public had limited knowledge of what state medical boards did, the fact that they exist, what their role was, that they weren't there to protect physicians, but actually to protect the public. So we knew this through the media, through literature, but also we conducted a Harris poll and surveyed the public about this and found disappointing but not unsurprising results that the public really didn't know who we or our member boards were. We also know that, especially with respect to sexual misconduct, barriers that exist to reporting involve the power imbalance that exists between a patient and a physician. It's difficult to report when you're in that power imbalance, and this doesn't necessarily have to exist between a physician and a patient, but it can be between physician colleagues or between a trainee supervising physician. And further, there's lack of protection for the reporter, whether that reporter is a colleague, a trainee, or a patient. We learned a lot about data and transparency, as Dr. King mentioned. We know that it's difficult to analyze data about sexual misconduct because of the ways in which those disciplinary actions are coded. They're often labeled generally as unprofessional conduct, whereas we need coding that reflects the actual nature of the board action, the content of the board action. So we knew that this needed to be addressed in our report. The work group learned a lot about chaperones and a more technical term, practice monitors. We heard especially from Australia that had done a lot of research in this area, and Canada. And those 2 jurisdictions have fairly opposing methodologies for implementing or not implementing chaperones and practice monitors. We heard a great deal about remediation and reentry. First of all, from the subject matter expert who was on our work group, who talked about different character types of physicians who offend and the remediation potential in types. But we also heard about remediation from the perspective of our survivors and many of the public advocates who provided input into our process. The people who are engaged in the work of remediation have seen it work from their perspectives, whereas the patient advocates and the public that we speak to think that it should be a one strike and you're out type of approach. They feel that there shouldn't be any leeway when even a potentially minor instance of sexual misconduct has occurred. So we needed to figure out whether we were going to specify a threshold that exists for types of actions and even character types. And finally, one of the key issues involved trauma. We heard a really excellent presentation from an organization that provides trauma-informed training to organizations, including medical boards. Some of our member boards had actually received these types of presentations either in their states or from national organizations or policing organizations. And we felt this needed to inform our process. But one of the things we heard was that certain state medical boards who had received this training either received the training at the board level or at the staff level, but not necessarily both. And so we knew we needed to find ways to have everyone coming from an equal playing field in order to understand the nature of trauma and how it can impact the investigations, the enforcement, and even the adjudication process. So during our comment period, we actually heard a lot of these same themes over again. So I think that told us that we were probably hitting the right topics, but also that we needed to expand upon them and clarify what the guidance that we were going to provide would involve. We heard a lot about notifications to law enforcement. We had mentioned it in our initial draft, but didn't really elaborate on it. So we decided we needed to include a broader section about notification to law enforcement and specify the conditions under which law enforcement should be notified, which in reality is nearly in every instance. We heard a lot more skepticism about the feasibility of remediation in instances of sexual misconduct. We heard particularly from state medical boards about the barriers they face with respect to the duty to report, especially coming from institutions, hospitals, and health systems. Again, we heard about transparency of data. We wondered whether state medical boards were communicating with patients to a sufficient degree. And we heard that there was a perception that they were not. And so this became important for our rewrite of the policy. We heard a lot about education, and we knew that we need to expand the content there. And again, we heard about chaperones and practice monitors from the perspective of the public, of external organizations, including from other countries. Australia responded, New Zealand responded, and several Canadian jurisdictions responded about chaperones and practice monitors. And we also heard about this from the perspective of the state medical boards themselves. So I'm going to hand it back to Dr. King to talk about some of the specific recommendations that were made in our work group's report.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So the report actually has many recommendations, but Mark and I are going to talk about some of the highlights of those today. So first, and this is actually the first recommendation in the report, is a call for a change in culture. And as I mentioned before, the report of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine recognized the need for cultural change and actually pointed to medicine as being an especially prevalent culture for potential harassment and including sexual harassment. So we really wanted to emphasize that across the continuum from medical education to practice, that all groups of medicine should continue to eliminate harassment and build a culture that's supportive of professional behavior and one that is really intolerant of harassment of any type. And it's important for so many reasons. Not only do victims suffer, but those who are bystanders suffer in just believing that this is kind of the normal environment and dissuading any reporting of observation of sexual misconduct or harassment. It really undermines education and attainment. It undermines the work environment and therefore the care of patients. And then ultimately, if this is allowed to go on, it can directly patient risk for being victims of sexual misconduct. So it's really incredibly important, we thought, that we all look to address the culture and to eliminate harassment in the environment of medicine. So the next slide then, Mark, we've talked a lot about transparency, and Mark has gone over this also, but we really felt that state boards should ensure that sufficient information is publicly available to justify regulatory decisions and provide sufficient rationale to support them. So in the information that's given to the public, we're there to protect the public. The public hopefully needs to deserve our trust, and being transparent is an important foundation in building that trust. As Mark pointed out, in terms of board actions, having clear coding processes and accurate descriptions of behaviors underlying the discipline in our board actions is so important. When we actually did a review of the board actions out of Michigan regarding Larry Nassar. There were, I think, 4 or 5 board actions over the 18 months that the Michigan board was putting out board actions and reporting on Dr. Nassar's activity. But it really wasn't until the final board action that there was a clear statement of sexual misconduct and assault. The others prior to that had used much more vague language, and that is not uncommon on board action. So it's a hope and an aspiration of ours that board actions be more clear and consistent terminology used between states and between medical boards. I mean, all of these points are clearly important for us to collect data, for us to really understand the problems, to follow trends, and to begin to look at outcomes for our work and for any remediation that may take place. And then finally, we need to be transparent that will help maximize our reach and impact to the public. So the next slide then talks about another key recommendation, and that was on complaints. We've talked a lot about the importance of hearing, of the state court hearing about misconduct. And the way our system works is that we are based on a complaint system. So we really need to facilitate reporting of misconduct in every way we can. We need, as state boards, to provide easily accessible information, education, and clear guidance about how to file a complaint. And that includes really making this information available in multiple languages. And then we need to convey to the public and to all groups why complaints are necessary for supporting effective regulation and safe patient care, and why early reporting is so important for preventing further public harm. In terms of the ways in which we deal with those complaints then after they've been received on the state board level, we recommended frequent communication with complainants throughout the complaint and investigative process. We recommended addressing these complaints as quickly as possible and not having them kind of get hung up in the system for extended periods of time. And we highly recommended specialized trained navigators or liaisons for working with the complainant through the process of both filing and going through the investigation and adjudication of the complaints. So I think Mark's going to go on with the next couple of key recommendations.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll talk about reporting first. The Federation is no stranger to the issue of duty to report. We developed a statement that was adopted in 2016 on the importance of the duty to report among the profession. We've held full-day symposia on the issue, and we tried to provide recommendations, both formally and informally, about it. So in this context, we really tried to relate it to the issue of sexual misconduct, but also brought to light some of the issues and barriers that we've heard from our boards over the last few years. We surveyed about the duty to report back in 2017, shortly after our policy statement was adopted. And we heard a lot of frustration on the part of state medical boards about their ability to levy fines against hospitals that do not report to the state medical board when the hospital is aware of an instance of sexual misconduct that's occurred. So many boards actually have the statutory ability to levy fines, but they're reluctant to engage in any legal proceedings with hospitals because of the imbalance of resources involved. They just don't want to go to battle in court. It would cost the board too much money that they really don't have. So we highlighted that as important. Boards need the ability to levy these fines and potentially even name the reasons for having levied fines to encourage institutions to report. We flagged peer review processes specifically. The work group was well aware of the reasons for protecting the results of peer review processes when these relate to quality improvement or performance in practice. But they felt that data from peer review processes related to sexual misconduct was fundamentally different from data that's meant to help improve quality. And so felt that this should actually be shared, should not be subject to the same protections, and needs to be reported to state medical boards for the protection of patients. Talked about stronger hospital reporting requirements. There was the issue of the 29-day suspension that came up several times, where hospitals would find ways to discipline internally, but not actually have to report. So if you discipline a physician for 29 days in many states, it doesn't meet the 30-day suspension threshold that would require a report to state medical boards. And then within the practice itself, the work group felt that there should be more power on the part of the state medical board to levy fines or sanctions against physicians for non-reporting. And so boards actually provided us feedback during the consultation about, what exactly would dictate that a physician should have reported or would make them subject to fines for non-reporting. And so we did a legislative review and found that the laws actually vary to a great degree across the states. From reasonable belief, firsthand knowledge, actual knowledge of an event. But what the work group found was that throughout all of these varying laws, one of the common themes was reasonability. So if it was reasonable to expect that sexual misconduct had occurred or a boundary violation had occurred, then reporting should also occur. And then finally, whistleblower protection in instances where reporting does occur. And along with that goes the importance of allowing reporters to remain anonymous in that process. Now, with respect to investigations, it was fairly clear to the work group when an investigation should pause and focus should be placed on removing the licensee from practice. But they also talked about patterns of potentially smaller or less egregious violations that could also provide a reason to remove someone from practice. So it was really important to the work group that the state medical board have the authority to impose terms or limitations, including suspension, prior to the completion of an investigation to remove those physicians when they felt that there was a real risk of danger to the public. Again, training and trauma-informed processes was quite important. And as I mentioned before, this needs to be from the top down. So the board needs to be trained, as do the investigators, the enforcement attorneys, including anyone who's actually interacting with a complainant or the subject physician. I'll talk a little bit about discipline. Again, revocation for repeated commission of lesser acts was quite important. So if a physician had not learned their lesson or it was clear that they were not remediable, then they should be removed from practice according to this work group. Now, practice monitors versus chaperones. The work group wanted to delineate, and we were not the first to do this. Actually, there was a report to the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency that drew this delineation between a chaperone and a practice monitor. So we saw the chaperone as more of a casual arrangement, often initiated by the physician, and often to protect the physician as much as the patient. So the physician could bring a nurse in, an employee into the office during any exam, whether it's intimate or not. Whereas a practice monitor is something different. It's a more formal arrangement. It's one that's imposed by the state medical board. And the person who serves in that role as a practice monitor needs to specify particular, or needs to have a certain background and training to be allowed to serve as a practice monitor. Their reporting relationship would not be between the practice monitor and the physician. Rather, it would be between the practice monitor and the state medical board. The work group recommended the practice monitors have a health professional background and go through adequate training to perform this role. One of the reasons that the work group thought it was really important to draw this delineation is because there's a current trend that, again, started in Australia, but has since made its way to certain jurisdictions in the US of no longer using chaperones or practice monitors as an interim condition. So Washington State, for example, does not use practice monitors, and they base this largely on what they heard from Australia. Our work group felt, though, after partly what they heard from some Canadian jurisdictions, that if you implement a program where practice monitors do have the appropriate backgrounds, the appropriate reporting relationships, and are adequately trained to know exactly what is appropriate and what is not appropriate in a physician-patient encounter, that it provided the board with an additional tool in their toolbox to be able to protect patients, especially if they don't have adequate information through investigations to remove that physician from practice. So the work group identified this divide between using and not using chaperones and practice monitors, but felt that it was important to allow it to remain an option for state medical boards who wish to continue to use them. Finally, on the issue of remediation, the work group felt that there were many instances where it was clear that remediation should not be considered after instances of sexual misconduct. Again, we heard about this loud and clear from the survivors who spoke with us, but felt that there were instances where remediation would be appropriate, but it had to be through a very detailed process and created several stipulations for how this process ought to occur. I'm going to hand it now back to Dr. King for education.
Thank you, Mark. And I apologize. I didn't have my video on before, so I'm sorry about that. So obviously, we felt that education was very important and that there was a lot of opportunity to improve education to multiple groups in this process. Mark mentioned that we had a very large session at the annual meeting in 2019. And at that meeting, we really heard from many of the state boards across the country. And everyone really remarked on the need for physicians to understand how to do an exam in a sensitive way and how to communicate in a sensitive way. And it was interesting because it wasn't, we thought that might be primarily for older physicians, but it was also for younger physicians. So clearly, education and training about professional boundaries, physician sexual misconduct should be provided during medical school and residency, but also continue during practice as part of a physician's effort to remain current and competent. So this was a very basic point, a very basic ask, but really important. Likewise, education on professionalism and professional culture, we've talked about that already. That would involve collaboration with multiple groups in medicine, from education up to practice. We highly recommend also that state boards and the Federation work on educational modules for patients on what to expect during intimate exams. This was actually a comment that was brought to us by our survivors who we spoke with at length. They felt that the public should have some understanding about what is normal and what isn't normal, that often that power differential clouds your interpretation of what is normal and what isn't, and that the public should know directly on what to expect and when they really should have concerns and should have more or should know some basic information on reporting to state boards and law enforcement. And then finally, the work group called Federation to develop materials, which Mark will talk a little bit about that, what the Federation is doing now, but materials for education of both the public as well as physicians. And then I will also, again, Mark mentioned education on trauma, but I will also bring that up here because I think that that's an important part of education for state boards, both staff and board members, in terms of understanding sexual misconduct and understanding the public who are bringing these complaints. So I'll turn it back over to Mark then for implementation.
Yeah, this is a very lengthy report. It's the Federation's longest policy now, with the most recommendations at 38 recommendations. It could easily have held more than 38 recommendations, but the work group felt We needed to cut it off somewhere, and we needed to have a policy approved because state medical boards and the public, including through the media, were asking for it. But we didn't want to lose sight of some of the things that could have made their way into additional recommendations and that still needed to be done, whether it was for patients, for state medical boards, or for our partner organizations. So the very final recommendation in the policy relates to implementation. And the work group felt it was really important that the FSMB shouldn't let this policy collect dust on a shelf, but should help facilitate the adoption of operationalization of these recommendations by providing a series of resources or additional policy documents or model legislation. So we've still been engaged in continuing dialogue with a lot of medical boards about what their needs are with respect to sexual misconduct and the regulation thereof. But we have made a very important a promise, really, to continue to support boards in this regard through the development of resources, but also by helping them analyze their own data, collecting that data, analyzing the data that boards provide to us. And again, if training is needed, we can find ways of either identifying that training or providing it for boards. So again, this is a commitment from the Federation in this last recommendation to continue this type of dialogue. And I think it's evidenced by the fact that we were so happy to come and speak with you today about this issue, because we see it as something that's going to require a lot of work on an ongoing basis.
So I'm going to finish up really by thanking our work group members. And I want to begin by thanking Carrie Webb. Again, I mentioned Carrie earlier, but she came to our symposium last spring, actually, spoke about what California has done and some of the changes you have made. And it was really very helpful for our work group to hear those. And those are actually discussed in the report that I'm sure you've seen if you've read the report. But our work group members, I'll just really quickly go through these people because I cannot thank them enough. They were really very dedicated and engaged. And as I mentioned earlier, we all grew together in understanding, a much better understanding of this very important issue and topic for state boards. So Kevin Bonablust is the executive director from Wyoming. Rebecca Brendel was one of our subject experts. She is the director of the master's program in bioethics at Harvard Medical School. Catherine Caldecott was our expert in remediation and works for PBI. Elliot Krieger is with the AMA. He is also in charge of their ethics program. Catherine Fisher from the Oregon Board. Fakisha Fripp from the Washington, D.C. board, Marula Gleaton from the Maine board, Alex Gross from the Georgia board, Teresa Hubka was our representative from the AOA, Amba Janakalada from the North Carolina board, myself, Ann Lawler, the executive director from the Idaho board, Florence Lefebvre represented the Canadian regulatory authorities. Jean Rexford was a public member from the Connecticut board, Michael Schottenstein from the Ohio board, and then Scott Steingard and Cheryl McGill on the board of directors, and obviously Hank Chowdhury, as well as Mark Stas, who was our staff member. And I cannot thank Mark enough, who did just a wonderful job organizing all of this and doing really the basic writing of the policy. So thank you.
Thank you.
So Denise, thank you so much for giving us the time to present. We're happy to answer any questions. And
great.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Yes, you can.
This is Howard Krause, Dr. King, and Mr. Stas. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm a huge fan of the FSMB, and the FSMB creates a lot of valuable work and documents which in the California board we have taken great advantage of. The FSMB is also a wonderful forum to participate in. One of the beauties of this nation is we have 50 plus simultaneous social experiments going on throughout the nation, and we can readily learn from one another's successes and failures by collaboration, and the FSMB is the perfect platform for that. Let me say that many of us recommend preventative medicine, that it's better to avoid ingestion of poison than to treat poisoning. Many issues of harm or potential harm to the public, including sexual misconduct, derive from the misbehavior of unethical physicians, some of whom may have underlying personality disorders. Has the FSMB looked at whether or not medical schools, postgraduate training programs, and medical boards do an adequate job of investigating the ethics of applicants prior to their granting admission or licensure?
I can offer the beginning of an answer. If Dr. King wants to add, she certainly can. We actually included the Association of American Medical Colleges and ACOM on the osteopathic side, as well as the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education in both our in-person symposia as well as our comment period, and talked to them about this particular issue to a great degree. We also know as co-sponsor of the United States Medical Licensing Exam that it's important to assess medical students and graduate and residents about their ability to identify particular boundary issues, address them appropriately, and also screen out potential issues before physicians enter practice. So I would say that we're at a preliminary level of assessing these issues and working with our partners to address them. But thanks for flagging that. Thanks also, Dr. Krause, by the way, for your involvement in our community, including on our work group for stem cell therapies.
Thank you.
Thanks. I would just add that I know that medical schools, I'm at a medical school, we struggle with this all the time. It's not, admissions is not perfect, and but also we know that environments can make a difference. So I think it's really incumbent on us as educators to have the best environment, free of harassment of all types, sexual harassment and otherwise, so that students and people learn as they go through that it's really just unacceptable for the best care for our patients. So it's certainly an important issue, and we'll continue to keep working on it on all levels.
Great. Are there any additional comments from members?
Yes, Pines.
Okay, Dr. Thorpe.
Thank you, Ms. Pines, and thank you to Dr. King and you, Mr. Stoss, for this excellent presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I was intrigued by the distinction between practice monitors and chaperones, and in terms of the practicality in, it's one thing to be in a large academic practice or to be in a large multi-specialty practice, but for many doctors, in fact, for most doctors still throughout the United States, they're in small or solo and small group practices. And the idea, of course, intimate exams is one of those places where misconduct can occur, but the power differential occurs all across the spectrum, and many times it's not related to an intimate exam. So my question is, has the FSMB considered the practicality of how to implement either practice monitors or an indifferent chaperone system that isn't an employee of the practice?
Yeah, we heard a great deal about the impracticality of establishing this type of system. There would be potential financial barriers, staffing-related barriers, and we heard about these from state medical boards throughout our process. However, we've also seen it work in particular jurisdictions. And so I'll note the jurisdiction of Ontario, Canada. So the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario has a practice monitoring program where they basically develop a roster of appropriate practice monitors that can be assigned to physicians. Where cost is an issue, the costs are borne by the physician themselves. So if they wish to remain in practice, either while an investigation continues or after discipline has been imposed, then they need to bear the cost of having a practice monitor that has been assigned by that regulatory authority. Further, we tried to provide some initial suggestions for making this a little bit more implementable or a little bit more practical or feasible for state medical boards. One of those is actually to approach this similarly to how expert witnesses or experts in quality of care cases are approached by state medical boards, where again, a pool of experts or a pool of practice monitors is developed that can both be called upon when needed, but also can rotate across. Because we realize that just like in an employment relationship with a chaperone, with a practice monitor that's been with a physician for a long period of time, a sort of dual relationship can exist where either collegiality can develop and could potentially bias the practice monitor. So we thought it would be valuable to have a broader pool that could be pulled from and that could rotate through different physicians. So I certainly appreciate the concern about the practicality of implementing this recommendation. And the work group did recognize that, but felt it was still important to provide some guidance for those state boards who are able to implement this.
Just a follow-up question, and that is, so you're really talking about monitoring after discipline has been, or after some type of aberrant behavior has been identified. I'm really talking about it in the terms of trying to prevent that from happening on the daily basis as you're practicing. I think Dr. Krause's point is extremely well taken, that this is a process that has to be addressed in its inception as you're considered to be a medical student. That is a significant part of it, and throughout your medical student training, throughout residency. But then as you get into in a working environment, then it still needs to be a consideration of how do you practice with a professional. Unfortunately, professionalism has been extremely downplayed, especially in medicine. In part because of this hierarchical situation, the white coat and all that that it entails. But in giving up a lot of that professional array or aura, if you will, the professionalism itself has been lost. And so there's it's a much, anyway, obviously we can't go into it all here, but my concern was more in terms of the chaperones and practice monitors. I totally understand how it could work in terms of a disciplinary process, but I'm really looking at it from the standpoint of my colleagues who are just practicing. How do we give the sense that we can be trusted, that we are doing everything possible to ensure that the patient, whether it's male or female, is going to be honored or going to be safe in our care during the time that they're with us? That's really more of my concern.
Yeah.
I might just add to that. I think going back to growing an environment that's free of harassment, and we talk about being free of any misconduct. I think we need to talk about it more. I think what I think the work group found was the education on trauma was really very important for the way we thought, and that clinicians should think about the impact of their behavior on every single patient. I think we need to grow that in our professionalism and to think about, we really don't always think about every single patient in terms of trauma they may have been through, but in a preventative way, that maybe is something that's important. So, I agree. We have to think about professionalism more and maybe in slightly different ways.
Hi. Teacher, hello? This is Teacher Watkins. I have some questions, but first I would like to thank Dr. King and Mr. Stas for creating an incredible foundation from which to build from. My question relates to this cultural shift when you were giving the presentation, the cultural shift that we have to undergo in order to actually become more transparent, to encourage a culture of complaint, to encourage a certain transparency in that reporting. And the reason why I say that, and it may even answer Dr. Thorpe's question, is that unless we change that culture, and that culture means right through all the whole regulatory process, from the staff to the DAGs to everybody that's participating in this process. The deal is everybody has to sign up on that, because, and this is my question, I have had the instance where there is a difference made on sexual misconduct, whether the person that the sexual misconduct was affected upon was a patient, and if they weren't a patient and they were another public member by a physician, then it would be almost deemed in the nuance as lesser. And I would love your input on that. Is it in fact lesser?
I would begin by saying that no, sexual misconduct is sexual misconduct. And actually, in the policy, the definition of what constitutes sexual misconduct has been revised, the 2006 version. And it's been revised to define it as existing along a spectrum, right? So there are different types and categories of sexual misconduct, and some are less egregious than others. But the point that's made after sort of establishing that spectrum within the policy is that all of these instances, regardless of where they exist on the spectrum, are worthy of the attention of state medical boards and the intervention of state medical boards. I'd also add to that the work group addresses patients, but also addresses patient surrogates early on. So it could be the family member of a patient or the surrogate of a particular patient. It doesn't have to be the patient themselves. And the policy also goes to greater lengths than before about identifying misconduct within professional circles. So with colleagues or trainees or employees or even allied health professionals that one works with. And so Dr. King is really sort of our cultural expert, so I'll hand it over to her. But I think that's where the policy at least is.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Yip. Again, thanks for the great presentation of both. Are there any other state medical board that require mandatory CMEs on the professionalism, boundaries, ethics, implicit bias training, substance abuse, etc. for the licensee, like every 5 years?
You know, Mark might know also, but I think there are a couple, just a couple of boards that have requirements for continuing education on sexual misconduct. I think all but a couple of boards have CME requirements in general, but of those, which is most of the boards, I think only a couple have requirements for sexual misconduct. Do you know, Mark, what the number is exactly?
I don't know the exact number, but you're correct that, yeah, a couple of boards do have requirements that relate specifically to sexual misconduct. A greater number of boards have requirements that relate to ethics and boundaries, however. So sexual misconduct specifically, I believe it's only 2 boards, but ethics courses that are required will touch upon misconduct and boundary violations, and that's a greater number of boards. The Federation actually collects data on the CME requirements of all of our member boards, and we now have actually available on our website 2018 data in our regulatory report, but we're in the middle of collecting data for our 2020 version of that publication, which will be out towards the end of this year. We'd be happy to share that with the board, though, and we have more nuance as well that's available.
Okay, great. I think we should start doing that in California too. Thank you.
Dr. Hawkins, may I speak?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much. Very informative and necessary. Warrants repeating multiple times. My question, and not to diminish the mission of the Federation, did any discussion evolve into how far back to go? And by that I mean, we know that power, disparity develops very, very early. And I wonder if there's any discussion about that. How far to go back, and whether bringing the educators into this process, the grammar school, the high schools, just any discussion, even though this is not necessarily the board's mission.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Now, do you mean in terms of investigations, how far back to go in investigations, or are you talking about like a statute of limitations that would not allow disciplinary action or investigation?
I'm sorry. The reason I mentioned it's not necessarily in the mission of the Federation. How far to go back in boys and girls, men and women, prior to medical school and college, et cetera. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Do you understand my question?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Dr. King can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that we held discussions about how far to go back. We certainly did discuss the importance of this, both at the medical school level, but also prior to medical school, the types of students who are allowed into medical school, the types of individuals who are allowed into medical school, and backgrounds and personality types that would be most appropriate for ensuring a culture of professionalism and patient safety and well-being. But I don't believe we had discussions that talked about going earlier than that. Dr. King, am I correct?
No, we didn't. But I think the point is well taken. Obviously it's not just the culture of medicine, but it's the culture of our society. Certainly, what we learned from the National Academy report was that medicine was no different from other professions and no different from the rest of society. So in some ways, maybe we have an opportunity to lead in that regard and make other changes that will permeate our whole society. And you're absolutely right when you talk. I heard you mention grade school. I mean, if you read the literature on development in children, they'll say it's the most important is before the age of 3. But so it's all about respect for people and having an environment of respect. So, but that's a good point. I think medicine could be a leader in this regard of making greater society changes.
Thank you again.
Great. Any other members?
Yeah, Ms. Frank.
I have one question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Lori.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, from my experience, I've noticed how sexual misconduct cases often has some connection to drug or alcohol use. And I was wondering if the working group had noticed that too, and whether that observation may have affected or your recommendations or made you make other observations.
We certainly acknowledged potential impairments in the policy, but it didn't feature prominently, and that's in part because the Federation has a policy on physician impairment where these issues are addressed more directly. In fact, that policy is currently under review. The current version is from 2011, and we expect to have a new policy completed before the end of 2021. So the work group felt that was important, that these could be instances or at least catalysts for patterns of behavior related to sexual misconduct. And we heard about that at our very first work group meeting, actually, from one of our subject matter experts. However, it was only really addressed in broad terms in this policy because it's been addressed in the impairment policy itself.
Got it. Thank you. And just one more other question. I noticed, with respect to the education piece and transparency, I'm wondering, in your recommendations, do you outline specific proactive ways for a board member for state boards to conduct effective outreach? Are there actual, specific things that we can do? Is that outlined there?
And Mark might know. I mean, we don't have specific things, maybe, except that certainly we talk about multiple approaches, not to use just one approach for outreach, but to use multiple approaches because different people receive information differently. So we do have some examples from different states within the report. But maybe that might be something that the Federation could develop and give to state boards in terms of more specific a variety of approaches that have more specific examples. So thank you. We'll take that back. I don't know, Mark, if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and it relates to the point that we finished with about implementation of a lot of these recommendations. So we do have some, I wouldn't call them specific points of guidance, but we talk about the types of things that ought to make their way into some of these patient education resources. So about, and Dr. King touched upon this briefly, but about what to expect from a physical exam, what's not normal, what to do if something happens that you feel was not appropriate. So we do have specific mentions about that. And the other thing, we thought a good starting point would be to flag some educational resources that the work group felt were a fairly good quality, and that both state medical boards as well as physicians may want to make use of. So there is an appendix to the policy, and it's included right after the policy recommendation is complete, that has a few different categories of educational resources. So some on sexual misconduct and professional boundaries. There's another category for trauma-related resources. And then the third category, and we didn't talk about this much today, but it's actually been a very important topic for the Federation and for our member boards, is we have a category of resources on implicit bias. And we felt those were important both for practicing physicians, but also for board members in their adjudication responsibilities. But again, thanks for that question, and we'll make sure that we do try to provide some more specific guidance as we go forward.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Mahmood?
Dr. Mahmood? Yes. So I have a little concern when we are talking about going to the level of grade school or a high school or college. We know that over 50% who are under the age of 18 have used alcohol and drugs, which is illegal at that age. And a lot of these things happen when they are under the influence. And over 90% of the kids, when they are in college, they regularly drink. And over 70% of the kids, when they're in college, they use drugs occasionally or regularly. And a lot of these things happen during that time. And if we're going to start following them on all those things, unless there's a major offense, so many kids are going to be barred from going to medical school or other professional schools. There got to be extensive education at that level before we start on this level to go and work. Obviously, this is a very important issue, but the issues which are leading to this, they should be addressed at the same time before we start penalizing and restricting them to pursue their career. What is your thought on that?
You know, I think that there are a couple of different ways that this can be addressed. And what I heard from, I believe it was Dr. Watkins who asked, Dr. Hawkins who asked the question. What I heard was about educating on the importance of respecting boundaries, both professional and personal. And I think that can be achieved at any level, beginning at the early ages that Dr. King mentioned, without necessarily needing to bar people from being accepted into medical school. And so, I think this is something that we've already started to work with at the medical school level, trying to implement these things into a curriculum. But it also goes along with Dr. Krause's opening question that relates to sort of the preventive aspect of all of this. So understanding why boundaries are important, what would constitute a violation of a boundary, and why that matters, why it would be a harm to the person whose boundary has been violated. And so if you educate on those, you might actually prevent instances of future misconduct in the profession or before.
Great. Are there any other board members that have any comments or questions?
Yeah, Denise, Dr. Ganade.
Okay.
Dr. King and Mr. Stas, thanks for coming, Dave Ganade. Just want to give some info is that 2 years ago when we opened a brand new medical school, we actually did the personality tests on all the interviewees and were able to identify a few who had a narcissistic personality and did not look at them as even though they had great scores. So, and then put in the ethics and professionalism, which includes sexual misconduct, as one of the top topics in the first 2 years of medical school. So they just became a third-year students. So we'll see how they behave. We don't know yet. It's a very small class. The first class was 68 students. So I think it's worth really following. And unfortunately, neither the medical school nor the residency programs nor the large departments take a lot of interest in really teaching ethics and professionalism. Usually we concentrate on clinical care and quality of care, and we don't go into that. So that's where I think we should probably through FSMB, through AMA, and through AAMC, I think we got to push this thing more so that this is actually prevention. So when you prevent something, you don't hurt somebody. That is the patients I'm talking about. So I think that's the right way to go. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I have one additional comment on Dr. Gananadev's concern about screening out those with narcissistic personality disorders. If we screened out people with narcissistic personality disorders, there are certain surgical subspecialties which would not be filled, and we'd have fewer people running for political office or becoming president.
Okay, so we will end on that note. Thank you, Dr. King and Mr. Satz. You guys did a fantastic job. I know it was a lot of work, and we really appreciate it. This is going to be immensely useful for all of the boards, including ours. So thank you so much for joining us. I now want to go to the host for public comments.
Okay, I've opened up the Q&A panel. If anyone would like to make a comment, please send me a message in there and we'll call you in order. You receive them. First up, Hannah Ree, let me unmute your microphone. Hannah Ree, are you there?
Yes, thank you. So this is Dr. Ree from Black Patients Matter. I do have to say that it's probably inappropriate to mock folks with personality disorders. Narcissistic personality disorders are a real thing, and it's probably not appropriate to laugh at someone who has that. So in any event, if the FSMB is only now addressing sexual misconduct in medicine in the year 2020, then the policies related to racism in medicine, not just implicit but explicit bias, is a long way off. Dr. King had mentioned whistleblower protection associated with the policy, but unfortunately, the Medical Board Association here is corrupt, and the DCA unfortunately has learned to misuse their position. For example, after listening to the comments from Mr. Pasiska yesterday, it dawned on me that the problems that from what he's seeing, the problems that he's seeing actually occurred under Ms. Kimberly Kirchmeier. So as we recall, Ms. Kirchmeier stepped down after we at Black Patients Matter sued her for marginalizing our advocate group. And she now is at the DCA, and it's interesting that the mention was made about a whistleblower, because I have an email here from Eric Andrus, a wonderful patient advocate, who sent me an email and stated the DCA has subpoenaed all my Facebook information, which includes private conversations with you. So I'm wondering why it's necessary to subpoena patient advocate groups, especially ones that are successfully filing federal civil rights lawsuits against the medical board. So moving forward, I think we understand who is misusing their power, who is at the lead. So it does seem to be Ms. Kirchmeier. So the statement about whistleblower protection in the state of California, it means nothing to the patient advocate groups. And so, and just as an aside, Ms. Kirchmeier got her position at the DCA after we sued the DCA and Mr. Griffillo for corruption. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment.
Can I interject for a second? We are on a particular agenda item, we need to speak to that agenda item in these comments. Public comments on not agenda items, that has already occurred. Thank you.
Next up, I have Eric Andrews. Let me unmute your line. Eric Andrews, are you there?
I'm here.
Please proceed.
Marian Hollingsworth and I helped the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and reporter Carrie Teagarden with their big report on sexual assault by doctors. This is a very important topic for us. FSMB needs to know that the MBC has been fairly defiant anytime we bring problems to their attention with how they're handling, or should I say not handling, sexual assault cases. If they conveyed a different picture to you all, they put on a show for you and pulled the wool over your eyes. Carrie Webb is paid big bucks to protect this board, even though they do many things wrong. So you need to consider the source with her. She obviously wasn't completely truthful with you. Here's some examples. While Dr. Edwin Njoku in Connecticut was convicted of touching one patient, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison and must register as a sex offender. The Connecticut board revoked his license. Yet, here in California, Dr. Ramon Fakori was accused of sexual assault of 4 patients. While a jury deadlocked in court, the California Medical Board let him keep his license and bartered their own 7 years probation guideline down to just 35 months. Then, based on California's decision, the state of Ohio revoked his license outright. Dr. Esmail Najmabadi surrendered his license after pleading guilty to the fondling of female patients, one of which was a minor. His original MBC accusation contains 13 causes for discipline, including soliciting dates from a patient, resignation due to sexual harassment, and sexual harassment of a receptionist. It also included elements considered corrupt acts, including trying to get rid of a witness by reporting her to immigration and the IRS, encouraging an employee to lie to the police, asking his medical assistant to say one of the victims came on to him, and documenting that a female medical assistant was in the room with the patient when she was not. So what did our medical board do? They reinstated his license and put him on probation. If this had been a teacher or a police officer, they would have been fired and not allowed in the profession again. Dr. Rysard Chetskowski was found to have sexually assaulted 6 patients in his fertility clinic back in 1997. They bartered down his charges to a stipulated agreement of having to take a few classes and paid the board $5,000. If you look up this doctor on the Medical Board of California's website today, there's no record of any of this. None. And most egregiously is this board allows doctors to continue to practice even though they've been accused of sexual assault. They knew about Dr. Michael Popkin's sexual assault since at least 2005 and did very little to stop him. He went on to sexually assault more patients, and it wasn't until a victim took her case to the press that the medical board finally acted. This board rarely initiates an investigation on their own without someone filing a complaint because doctors are put on a pedestal. If a case appears in a newspaper, they won't follow up on it without a submitted complaint. I've been filing complaints now when I find them, and they're now closing them, saying I'm abusing the complaint system. And lastly, there's a case pending in San Diego where a California Department of Public Health proved that an anesthesiologist sexually assaulted a number of unconscious patients. The hospital even admitted it to one of the male patients who is now suing the doctor.
15 seconds.
This board knows about this case because we filed a complaint, which they closed saying it was a duplicate complaint. We don't know for sure that there is another one. Regardless, they're doing nothing about this doctor in the meantime. He's free to sexually assault more unconscious patients every day he goes to work. We have mounds of evidence to back this up if the FSMB wants it.
Thank you for your public comment. Next up, we have Marianne Hollingsworth. Give me a moment to open your line. I see you connected twice, Marianne Hollingsworth, so I'm going to give this a shot. We'll see if we get the right one the first time. Marianne Hollingsworth, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I would like to thank the FSMB for addressing the issue of doctor sexual misconduct and providing.
Could you please unmute mute your other device? We can hear the echo of you talking in the background from it. Seems like you're connected with 2 devices.
Is that better? Is that better?
We can still hear the echo, but I guess it'll have to do.
Is that better now? Is that better?
There's still an echo, but
okay,
it's okay.
I'll keep going. Please add this to my time. I know this board's record, and it can only be described as lenient and alarming. I know this board because I helped write a list of 450 doctors who have been disciplined or arrested for sexual assaults. On our website, forpatientsafety.org, we have 150 doctors just in the past 5 years who have been in trouble for misconduct. Under the board's disciplinary guidelines, the minimum recommended discipline for sexual misconduct is 7 years probation, yet this board consistently gives doctors less than that. For example, a few weeks ago, Dr. Ambati of Fresno was just given a reprimand for sexual misconduct with 2 of his technicians over several years. Dr. Ramon Fakori of Norco also had several victims, but only received 35 months. This board routinely reinstates the licenses of doctors who have been revoked due to misconduct, even when the victims include minors. This includes doctors Esmail Namadi of Bakersfield and Hari Reddy of Victorville. Not only did Reddy get his license back, but a board member who knew Reddy as a colleague, Dr. Gananadev, was allowed to sit on the panel that voted to reinstate his license. The FSMB's report says a board's legal department should decide whether a case should be referred to law enforcement. However, this board rarely refers a case to police. For example, in 2014, Dr. Jeffrey Abrams was found to have 1,300 illicit pictures of patients on his phone, yet the investigator let him continue practicing for 3 more months. One victim became fed up with this delay and went to the media. Only after the story ran did police get involved. Who knows how many other women Abrams victimized before he was arrested during this delay. The attitude of this board towards sexual misconduct is also alarming. Yesterday, during a Panel A hearing, the DAG mentioned that the doctor, quote, had suffered a conviction for sexual battery and criminal confinement. No one reacted to this comment. Only Mr. Watkins mentioned concern for the victim. So thank you for Mr. Watkins for that. I hope the FSMB recommendations will help this board raise the bar when it comes to doctors and sexual misconduct. I also recommend that the board include patient advocates in their stakeholders because we read every discipline, we know the board's patterns, and we know they are not doing enough to protect patients from predatory doctors. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. At this time, there are no other callers or requests